Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Zank. I'm the director of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and I welcome you to the 2019 Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture at Boston University. Before we start, I want to thank a few people who made tonight's event possible. Sarah Spells of the BU Alumni Association has once again partnered with us to get the word out to our alumni community. Nancy Mars and her team of audiovisual professionals are ready to record and provide us with the documentation of this event for everyone who couldn't make it or couldn't find parking because of the Red Sox. Dr. Teresa Cooney, the administrator of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and her team, communications assistant Catherine Gianni, graduate assistant Carolyn Barshaw, graphic designer Eike Winzer, and undergraduate assistants Talula Barkas and Connor Dedrick, put many hours of thoughtful planning and tireless attention to every detail for this event. So thank you, Sarah, Nancy, Teresa, and the entire team. Tonight's event is made possible by the generous support of Mr. Jonathan Krivine, a graduate of the College of Arts and Sciences, many a moon ago, and a good friend of the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies for the past decade and a half, at least. The Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture that he established and continues to support enables us to bring distinguished speakers to campus, people who care about Israel and about the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians that the late Prime Minister advanced at the cost of his life. Tonight's event is a little different from our usual Rabin lectures. Normally, we focus on the Middle East politics, on Middle East politics and peacemaking in the Middle East. Tonight, we want to explore a more proximate conflict, namely how we in this country think and talk to one another when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. The main question we want to consider tonight is whether we can still talk to one another about this topic at all, without ending up in a shouting match. Our families and communities seem increasingly divided over the politics of a country for whose actions we bear no direct responsibility, in whose elections most of us cannot vote, and that nevertheless claims our undivided loyalty as Jews. The question may be even more complicated for American Jews that are part of the growing Israeli diaspora. As American Jews, we cannot be indifferent towards Israel. This does not mean that Benjamin Netanyahu is our prime minister. But we take pride in Israel's achievements, not least of which is that there is a Jewish state at all. And we worry about its security. But as Jews, we also cannot be indifferent to Israel's actions. For the actions of the Jewish state reflect back on every Jewish person, every Jewish community. They raise questions about Judaism itself, who we are as a people and as a religious community. As Hillel, the Babylonian, said, "If I'm not for myself, who will be for myself? But if I'm only for myself, what am I?" This is the conundrum of having a Jewish state and a Jewish religion that wants to be more than an instrument of national self-preservation. The problem is not new, but our ability to consider it carefully seems to have been eroded, drowned out by the shouting and by the insidious oversimplification that comes from having to express oneself in elevator pitches, tweets, and bullet points. Speaking of bullet points, the graphic design for tonight's event casts our debate as a clash of values, whereby each of the two shouting individuals represent one side. One shouts peace, the other justice. One shouts never again, the other if not now. One shouts Mashiach now, the other peace now, and so forth. If you look closely, you will notice that the two faces are really one and the same. The clash between these values takes place within ourselves, but we have a hard time reconciling these voices thoughtfully and without yielding to our emotions. It seems we are forced to choose between one extreme or another. It is this choiceless choice, the erosion of the middle ground, the clouding of clear thinking, that makes the subject of tonight's conversation so troubling. Are we headed for divorce? I hope not. Here to lay out the issues that trouble us is Peter Beinart. Beinart is contributing editor at The Atlantic, a senior columnist at The Forward, and associate professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. You have details of his accomplished CV in your program, so let me just add two things. I was eager to have Peter Beinart speak at BU because I admire his ability to keep different voices in his head. He can give serious consideration to opinions he disagrees with without hiding his own opinion. This is an art, one that is much needed. The other reason why I always like to read and hear Peter is that he has a good sense of humor. We need a sense of humor in order to maintain and advance the conversation. Peter's talk will be followed by a panel moderated by Professor Lori Lefkovitz. Lori joins us from Northeastern University, where she serves as Ruderman Professor and Director of the Jewish Studies Program and the Director of the Humanities Center. Lori holds an honorary degree in Humane Letters from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and she served as a Fulbright Professor at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, among other honors. Her copious writings range from Holocaust memory to the construction of gender in Jewish literature, from the Bible to the present. Professor Lefkovitz will introduce the other panelists after the lecture. The panel discussion will be followed by a period of audience Q&A, also moderated by Professor Lefkovitz. I'll get to run around with a microphone. Please join us for a general reception after this event right outside of this venue. It is now my pleasure to call on Peter Beinart to deliver the 2019 Yitzhak Rabin Memorial Lecture at Boston University.
Thank you. It's Professor Zank and Dr. Clooney and Jonathan Krevin, who I had the pleasure to meet. Very honored to be asked to speak and to be asked to give a lecture in the name of Yitzhak Rabin at a center named for Elie Wiesel is more than humbling and intimidating. It's a little overwhelming, as is to have my remarks scrutinized by such a distinguished panel of people who, unlike me, are actually real academics as opposed to refugees from journalism. But that notwithstanding. Last month at Arizona State, a Jewish student told me, "Israel is what I don't want America to become." That sums it up. Like no other foreign policy topic, Israel has become a culture war issue for Americans and American Jews. How you feel about Israel has become a proxy for what you want for the United States. It wasn't always this way, at least not nearly as much. Think back to the 1980s. There were hints that the Republican Party was falling in love with Israel. You could see it in Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson's alliance with Menachem Begin. There were hints that the Democratic Party might one day fall out of love with Israel. You could see it in Jesse Jackson's advocacy of Palestinian rights in his 1984 and 1988 presidential campaigns, but this was at the margins. In the center, Ronald Reagan, who saw himself as Israel's friend and was seen that way by most Americans, repeatedly chastised and punished the Jewish state. He fought it over AWACS sales to Saudi Arabia. He condemned it for bombing Iraq's nuclear reactor. He suspended a strategic cooperation agreement after Israel annexed the Golan Heights. He told Menachem Begin in 1982 that Israeli airstrikes were creating a quote-unquote Holocaust in Lebanon. This wasn't President Ilhan Omar. This is President Ronald Reagan. Back then, Israel didn't divide the two parties in any fundamental or consistent way. In 1992, Bill Clinton attacked George H.W. Bush from the right for demanding too many Israeli concessions to the Palestinians. In 1996, Bob Dole turned the tables by attacking Clinton from the right for not moving the United States Embassy to Jerusalem. But when Republicans took the White House in 2000, they didn't move it either. Israel didn't divide the two parties very much because views about Israel didn't map clearly onto views about the United States. Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale's very different domestic policy agendas had little bearing on their policies towards Israel. This is crucial to why AIPAC in the 1980s, with a liberal Democratic executive director, former Ted Kennedy aide Tom Dine, and conservative Republican board members, became the most powerful American Jewish organization in the 1980s, because Democrats and Republicans checked their different domestic political views at Israel's door. The people who undergirded this bipartisan consensus and dominated American Jewish institutional life were what you might call secular tribalists. These were non-Orthodox but highly affiliated Jews, people who belonged to Reform or conservative synagogues mostly, but whose real devotion was not to Jewish religious practice, but to the defense of the Jewish people. Secular may be a little bit of an overstatement, but by secular in this context I mean non-halachic. Most of the secular tribalists were fairly liberal on domestic issues, but their focus on Jewish survival and self-protection led them to see Israel through a fundamentally different prism than they saw the United States. Domestically, they may have prioritized equality, but when it came to Israel, they prioritized Jewish security. The willingness of these secular tribalists to code switch, to distinguish between their equality-oriented vision for America and their security-oriented vision for Israel was crucial to the bipartisan consensus that existed in the 1980s and 1990s. It meant that a conservative Republican with hawkish views on American foreign and domestic policy could join with a liberal Democrat who held liberal views about American domestic and foreign policy, and both support Israel's right to pursue a hawkish foreign policy because the liberal wasn't applying the same standard to Israel that she was applying to the United States. As my old boss, Marty Peretz, once reportedly said, quote, "My pacifism ends at the deli door." This is now changing. The parties are diverging, and American Jews are diverging on Israel because debates about Israel are increasingly proxies for debates about America. I think this is happening for 4 reasons. The first is that secular tribalist Jewish parents have secular universalist Jewish children. Compared to their parents, the children are much less likely to code switch, to see Israel through a different lens than they see the United States. The recent rise of anti-Semitism notwithstanding, young secular American Jews are substantially less tribal than their parents, largely because they are further from the European experience and have experienced more radical acceptance in the United States. As a result, they don't feel the insecurity that leads them to make exceptions to their universalism because they perceive those exceptions as necessary for Jewish survival. This means they are less comfortable privileging Jews over non-Jews. You can see this in their greater willingness to intermarry. You can also see it in their views of Israel. When it comes to Israel, this refusal to privilege Jews over non-Jews plays itself out in 2 different ways. The first is indifference. If you don't privilege Jews very much over non-Jews, why care about Israel more than any other country? This is probably the biggest problem for J Street and other groups on the American Jewish left. Their biggest challenge isn't actually convincing young, secular, universalistic Jews to oppose Israeli policy. Their biggest challenge is convincing them to care very much about Israeli policy at all when there are issues like climate change that affect the whole planet. But there's a smaller group of non-Orthodox Jews, young non-Orthodox Jews, who express their universalism not in indifference to Israeli policy, but in opposition to Israeli policy. These kids tend to come from more affiliated families. They've spent time in a Jewish youth movement or a Jewish day camp or a Jewish day school often. They're the ones in J Street U, and if not now. Their upbringings have made them feel closer to Israel and the organized American Jewish community, and thus they feel more of a sense of betrayal. Because they identify with the American Jewish community, they feel shame when it violates what they perceive to be Jewish values. They're comfortable with the language of Jewish values because Jewish values can reflect universal moral principles. What they're less comfortable with is the idea of Jewish peoplehood or Jewish nationalism, because that suggests privileging us over them. This second, more engaged group of young, universalistic young Jews are not just critical of Israeli policy. They are more willing to question Zionism itself. The reason, I think, is that they're not anchored in the Zionism of refuge. Unlike their parents, they have never seen any large-scale exodus of Jews going to Israel to flee state-sponsored anti-Semitism. They don't even remember the Soviet Jewry movement, let alone the Holocaust. That makes them different from those American Jews, say, like Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, for instance, who criticized Israeli policy during the Lebanon War and the First Intifada in the 1980s. That older generation of critics, like Hertzberg, may have fiercely criticized Israeli policy, but they did not question Israel's existence as a Jewish state because they were anchored in the Zionism of refuge, the notion that Jews need a state of their own so they'll have somewhere safe to go. These younger secular universalists are less tethered to that notion, and that means that if they become alienated by what Israel does, they're more likely to question what Israel is. They're more likely to ask how someone who believes in liberal democracy, someone who opposes white and Christian privilege in the United States, can support a state in Israel that privileges Jews over non-Jews. They say the children remember what the parents wish to forget. And one of the things these young secular universalistic Jews are remembering is that before Israel's creation, there were prominent American Jewish voices who questioned political Zionism and flirted with the idea of a binational state. And for a generation of non-Orthodox Jews who are less comfortable than their parents, privileging Jews over non-Jews, and haven't experienced historical events that appear to confirm the need for a state of Jewish refuge, it's easier to revive this older pre-state questioning of political Zionism. When I meet non-Orthodox kids who defy this trend and are strongly Zionistic, I often ask them where their parents were born. Frequently, I find that their parents are Russian, South African, French, Argentinian, Iranian. They are closer to a family history of Jewish insecurity, and for them, therefore, the Zionism of refuge remains more alive. So this is trend number one, the replacement of secular tribalist parents who applied a different ideological framework to Israel than they applied to America, who code-switched, with secular universalistic children who apply the same framework to Israel and the United States. Trend number two is the rise of American Orthodoxy. When the secular tribalists dominated, American Jewish institutional life was quite secular. An Orthodox friend told me that in the 1970s he worked at the Anti-Defamation League. And in the winter, when Shabbat came in early, he asked his boss if he could leave work early. His boss said no. My friend said he was perplexed because had he worked somewhere else, he would have called the Anti-Defamation League. But he worked at the Anti-Defamation League. That world is long gone. It's long gone because as the children of secular tribalists have failed to replace their parents in establishment Jewish institutions, the gap has largely been filled by Orthodox Jews. Look at who marches in the Israel Day Parade in New York City. It's mostly kids from yeshiva day schools. Look at how many people show up for morning minyan at the AIPAC Policy Conference. One reason the divide among American Jews is growing wider is that you have these two demographically rising groups, young secular universalists on the one hand and young modern Orthodox Jews on the other, whose life experience is so radically divergent. The young Orthodox Jews are arguably less integrated into American society than their parents. Remember, there was a time when many young Orthodox Jews, like Joe Lieberman, for instance, went to public school. Now, most Orthodox Jews go to intensely Zionistic yeshiva day schools, modern Orthodox Jews, and spend a year in yeshiva in Israel after high school. It's a highly cloistered and particularistic experience. Young secular Jews, by contrast, are growing up in a much more assimilated environment than their secular tribalist parents. So it's no surprise that these two groups of young American Jews see Israel and America so differently. But what they share, the Orthodox and the secular Universalists, is that they are not code switching. Their vision for Israel is largely in line with their vision of the United States, which is why debates about Israel now map so clearly onto debates about America. Orthodox Jews now mostly vote Republican. They're comfortable allying with the Christian right because they don't support the domestic liberal cultural agenda, pro-choice, pro-gay rights, pro-separation of church and state, that most non-Orthodox Jews do. And since 9/11, especially in the age of Donald Trump, Orthodox Jews have become an important part of a Republican Party that sees Israel as embodying the values it wants in the United States. What does Israel represent for Republicans? A country where the military is nearly sacrosanct and which does not shy away from the use of force. A country dedicated to capitalist ingenuity. A country that is growing more religiously observant, not less, like the United States. A country that prizes sovereignty and dismisses international law. A country with a tough immigration policy, including walls, aimed at maintaining its cultural heritage. And a country that keeps a tight lid not only on Muslim immigration, but on its own Muslim citizens. Increasingly, pro-Israel institutions anchored by secular tribalists that defend Israel in the language of democracy are giving way to Orthodox-heavy pro-Israel institutions that define Israel in the language of civilizational conflict. You can see this in the demise of the magazine The Weekly Standard, which was anchored by secular tribalists like William Crystal and David Brooks, who were pro-immigration, and the rise of an institution like Breitbart, led by Joel Pollack, an Orthodox Jew, whose publication is fervently anti-immigrant and blatantly anti-Muslim. You can see it in the rise under Trump of the Zionist Organization for America, ZOA, which champions his anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant agenda. You can see it in the pro-Trump banners at the National Council of Young Israel's recent annual gala. Who is the most prominent spokesman in the American media defending the Israeli government today? Arguably, it's not a secular tribalist like Crystal or Alan Dershowitz. Arguably, it's Ben Shapiro, a young Orthodox Jew whose publication, The Daily Wire, has called Muslim immigrants to Europe a disease. Needless to say, the more Orthodox Jews reshape American Jewish institutions, the more young secular universalists disdain them, not just because of their views on Israel, but because of their interrelated views of the United States. This was perhaps best illustrated in 1917 when the Zionist Organization of America hosted Steve Bannon at its annual gala, and the group If Not Now protested outside. The third trend turning Israel into a proxy war over American identity is Israel's own move to the right. One reason conservatives love Benjamin Netanyahu and American liberals loathe him is that he's so American. During Netanyahu's first term as prime minister in the 1990s, a journalist asked his father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, how his son was doing. The old man replied, "His Hebrew is improving." Under George W. Bush, American liberals saw Bibi as an Israeli Dick Cheney, especially when he testified before Congress in favor of the Iraq War. Then, under Obama, during the Iran debate, he became almost a kind of Republican opposition leader. The president American conservatives wished they had. Now he's closely aligned in the American liberal mind with Trump. He's also closely aligned with an axis of hawkish nationalist leaders from Hungary to Brazil to Saudi Arabia, who liberals revile. The flip side of Israel's de facto alliance with Riyadh is that American liberals increasingly link the two regimes together. Netanyahu has also rid Israel of much of its socialist past, which makes it easier for conservatives to identify with Israel and harder for liberals too. For the last decade, there have been very few Israeli politicians that American liberals could identify with. If you ask folks in J Street U, or If Not Now, which Israeli Jews they admire, they might say the leaders of Breaking the Silence, activists who I also deeply admire, but not people who could claim to represent the Israeli Jewish public. Netanyahu's hostile relationship with Obama has also contributed to rising alienation toward Israel among African Americans. I've been told that one reason the Congressional Black Caucus rallied behind Ilhan Omar and pushed back against the resolution condemning her recently after her controversial remarks was that the Congressional Black Caucus felt that Israel and its American Jewish allies were again targeting a black politician. Beyond Netanyahu and as an individual, Jewish Israel has simply moved to the right in general. For the last decade, it has had a government that doesn't support a Palestinian state of the kind envisioned by the Clinton parameters, and more recently, even Benny Gantz, the supposedly left mainstream alternative to Benjamin Netanyahu, did not publicly support a Palestinian state. Israel has moved in the direction already favored by the American right. Remember that Sheldon Adelson left AIPAC in the 1990s because he claimed it was too supportive of the two-state solution. And it has moved in a direction that deeply disturbs the American left. America's rising, right-leaning, Orthodox-led, pro-Israel community is comfortable with one Israeli state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. But as the two-state solution recedes, this too makes young, leftist, secular, universalistic Jews reconsider Zionism itself. Since they're not anchored in the Zionism of refuge, if forced to choose between one state where millions of Palestinians lack basic rights and one state that, at least in theory, offers everyone equal rights, many will choose the latter. What the financial crisis was to millennials' views of capitalism, Benjamin Netanyahu has been for young American Jews' view of Zionism. Finally, the fourth and last trend turning Israel into a proxy war for American identity is the rise of Palestinian political activism. The Palestinian historian Rashid Khalidi once told me that Palestinian Americans had not yet produced their lawyers, by which he meant people totally fluent in American political culture. But that is now happening, first on campus and increasingly in the Democratic Party. As people of color, these Palestinian Americans, think of Linda Sarsour or Rashida Tlaib, integrate easily into the world of millennial leftist activism. They are especially effective in making the case for Palestinian rights to African Americans, Latinos, and other historically marginalized groups. And the Trump alliance with Netanyahu makes that easier. When Netanyahu champions walls to stop immigration, he makes the Palestinian-Latino alliance easier. The Black Lives Matter grew invested in the Palestinian cause in large measure because they realized that American police were getting training in riot control in Israel. And these millennial-led coalitions being built on campus are being transmitted into the Democratic Party, just as the student protest movements of the civil rights and Vietnam eras remade the Democratic Party in the 1960s and 70s. These Palestinian activists aren't talking, as a previous generation did, in the language of religion or even of nationalism. They're talking about human rights, equality, anti-imperialism, the lingua franca of the American left. And they're not only influencing people of color, they're influencing many of these young, secular, universalistic Jews who are more likely than their parents to meet and befriend Palestinians and other Arab and Muslim students on campus. The Palestinian student might say to the Jewish student, look, you're from New Jersey, I'm from New Jersey. We would hate to have a religious government here in New Jersey. Why should we as progressives support a secular government in Israel-Palestine? Why shouldn't we, as progressives, support a secular government in Israel-Palestine that guarantees equal rights to everyone? And because the Jewish kids agree with those Palestinian kids about their vision for America, and because they're less anchored in the Zionism of refuge, many are open to the conversation. We're often told in the American Jewish community that Jewish kids on campus are being menaced by Palestinian political activism. And there is certainly some of that, some Jewish kids who do feel uncomfortable. But in truth, many of the kids involved in the pro-Palestinian rights movement on campuses are in fact Jewish students themselves. On one campus where I went to speak, where Jewish students, I was told, felt under threat, I asked a few Jewish students which other students made them feel most comfortable for expressing Zionist or pro-Israel sentiments. They mentioned a fellow student at Hillel who often served as shaliach tzibur during services. So let me close with a couple of thoughts about where all this is heading. I think we're heading towards a series of tipping points. One, I think, may well happen during this presidential campaign. Bernie Sanders is betting that in a Democratic field where everyone is bunched up on the left, he can distinguish himself on Israel because that's one area where his competitors won't move decisively left. He's betting that there's a gap between party leaders in the Democratic Party who are more conventionally pro-Israel and grassroots activists who are more critical of Israel. A gap that's akin to the gap that Donald Trump exploited in 2016 in the Republican Party between a pro-free trade elite and a protectionist party base. Sanders has now moved beyond the "we must save Israeli democracy" two-state rhetoric of the Obama era to a bolder, unapologetic defense of Palestinian rights. The videos his team created from Gaza last year were unlike anything I've seen from a national American politician. Sanders is now on record supporting some conditioning of American military aid. When he gets on a debate stage and says something along the lines of, quote, "Given our domestic challenges, we shouldn't give nearly $4 billion no-strings-attached money to any foreign government, let alone one that violates our values," I think a roar will go up from the Democratic crowd. Sanders won't only win over some young Jews, he'll become the first candidate many Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim Americans have ever felt really excited about. It's worth noting that Sanders has a Muslim campaign manager. When Sanders does that, conditioning military aid will suddenly become thinkable in the Democratic Party. And when it becomes thinkable, it will be hard to oppose. How is the New York Times going to editorialize against Sanders' position? How are the hosts on MSNBC going to argue against it? Sanders' opponents will be on the defensive, and other Democratic politicians may see this as a winning issue, at least in Democratic primaries, just as Republicans learned from Trump that protectionism was a winning issue in the Republican Party. The other tipping point would be an Israeli annexation of the West Bank, as Netanyahu has now suggested, which could hasten the emergence of a post-two-state solution discussion among American liberals. We're already creeping in that direction. In mainstream progressive and democratic circles, the space to the left of liberal Zionism is growing. Think how radical J Street was considered when it started a decade ago. Now it has, if not now, an emboldened Jewish Voices for Peace, Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, all to its left. Think of the New York Times op-ed page. Its critics of Israel were once Thomas Friedman and Roger Cohen. Now they're Michelle Goldberg and Michelle Alexander, who are far more open to anti-Zionist arguments. It's a product of generational change and a progressive environment in which women and people of color have a larger voice. One day in the future, it will become untenable for the Times to cover this issue on its op-ed page without a Palestinian columnist. My guess is that in the years to come, as the result of this polarization, we'll see more high-profile arguments for one equal, secular, binational state from the left, and perhaps more high-profile arguments on the right for some form of transfer. Some new kind of Jordanian option that says Palestinians can have their state in Jordan, while the IDF retains control of the West Bank, and if West Bank Palestinians don't live in Jordan, well, they're welcome to move. The biggest question is what happens on the Palestinian side. The collapse of the Palestinian Authority, which strikes me as inevitable sooner or later, could hasten a shift toward a more explicitly pro-one-state Palestinian leadership. And if the Palestinians, especially with a charismatic leader, begin speaking explicitly about equality with the civil rights and anti-apartheid movements as their model, that could accelerate the shift on the American left. In Nathan Thrall's recent piece in the New York Times Magazine, he describes how representatives of the Palestinian Israeli civil rights group Adalah showed 5 Democratic members of Congress the text of the recent Israeli nation-state law alongside the bill proposed by Arab members of the Knesset for equal citizenship in a secular state. And the Democrats in Congress clearly preferred the latter. Let me end by saying something about what I think this means for dynamics about American Jews. It means the divide will grow larger and more fundamental. The center, liberal two-state Zionism, will shrink. One-state right-wing Zionism and one-state anti-Zionism will both grow. The debates will be even fiercer than they are now because they won't be about Netanyahu or the settlements. They'll be about the very existence of a Jewish state of Israel. Since 1967, American Jews have put Zionism at the center of our communal life. It's been the closest thing our communal institutions have to a common faith. I don't think it can continue to play that role, not at least unless we're willing to exclude much of the next generation, which means we need to invest in other things that give us a shared language and a shared bond. I think there's only one really good potential answer, and that answer, broadly defined, is Torah, the text that encapsulates 3 millennia of Jewish wisdom about who we are and how we live. If I had $1 billion to put into the American Jewish community, I'd create institutions where left and right-wing American Jews would put aside their differences about Israel and Trump and come together with great teachers to study Jewish texts. In my own life, the thing that has best preserved my relationship to people who hate my views of Israel is our common experiences of Jewish prayer and study and joy. Obviously, different American Jews will relate to Jewish texts in radically different ways, but just relating to them at all will be a bridge, a common discourse to replace the common Zionist discourse that is fading. If AIPAC increasingly can no longer bring American Jews together across partisan and ideological lines, maybe Limud and Mechon Hadar can. Is that utopian? Perhaps. But we need to think creatively about how to sustain our connection to one another as Americans, Jews, and members of the Jewish people in this new era, because I fear that our intracommunal civil war over Israel has just begun. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter Beinart. Am I audible in this room? Yes. Yes, oh good, because I don't hear it here. You've certainly, I think, given us things to discuss, for which we're grateful. I'm very glad for the chance to facilitate a conversation that I hope will nuance our analyses of the complexity of the multiple sets of relationships that we're going to be talking about. And I think your analysis is absolutely compelling, but necessarily an analysis with sweeping sets of schema and generalizations that we can then begin to enter in our conversation here. And I'm hoping that we will nuance the analysis with an eye towards identifying what we most wish for in building healthier sets of connections, identifying our highest values and goals, and possibly suggesting some paths forward. For myself, it's interesting to me that the larger topic about the American-Jewish relationship to Israel and the varieties of American Jews and their relationships to Israel lead you to a conclusion about Torah, which which feels a little bit like a non sequitur. You offer a solution to a different problem, maybe. But that said, I'm now going to introduce our panelists in the order in which they speak, which is from my left going this way, and whose bios will suggest how very relevant their varied expertise is to the subject that we're here to discuss. First, I want to add my thanks to Professor Michael Zank for organizing this event, and to the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, and to Teresa, and to all of you for being here to listen, and to the extent that time will allow, participate in this conversation. The size of the room that they chose for this occasion suggests to me that claims to increased American and American Jewish indifference to our relationship to Israel are at least open to question. This is the kind of topic that still seems to draw out the Jewish community in every generation. So first, to my immediate left, pull out your book, Dov, because I want to hold it up. You don't have it? Okay. First, I want to introduce my colleague, Dov Waxman, who is with me on the faculty at Northeastern University, where he's a professor of political science, international affairs, and Israel studies, and currently holds the Stotsky Chair of Jewish Historical and Cultural Studies, in which role he directs our Holocaust Awareness Committee. He co-directs the university's Middle East Center, and his research focuses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli foreign policy, U.S.-Israel relations, and American Jewry's relationship with Israel. The subject of his book, Trouble in the Tribe. Professor Waxman received his PhD and MA from the Johns Hopkins University and his BA from Oxford University. His most recent book, published by Oxford University Press, is The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, modestly titled, What Everyone Needs to Know. Yves Spangler will follow Dov immediately. Each panelist will speak for 5 or 6 minutes. She's Associate Professor of Sociology at Boston College, Professor Spangler's main interests include human rights in diverse settings, including Israel-Palestine, and within corporate workplaces. Her current work concerns the application of human rights criteria to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Dr. Spangler has served as assistant chair of the Boston College Department of Sociology and director of the department's graduate program. She chaired Boston College's Leadership for Change program, which promotes socially responsible business practices. She was also a visiting fellow in environmental and occupational health at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Spangler graduated summa cum laude from Brooklyn College, received her MA from Yale, and her PhD from the University of Massachusetts. And I would say that all of the three of us, I don't know about you, Rachel, lead summer trips or trips over the course of the school year with students to Israel or Israel-Palestine. And Rachel Fish will respond finally before assuming her current position, which is a senior advisor and resident scholar of Jewish Israel philanthropy at the Paul E. Singer Foundation, which is in New York City. Rachel Fish was executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, which is my alma mater. She completed her doctoral degree in the Near Eastern and Judaic Studies Department at Brandeis, where she researched the history of the idea of binationalism and alternative visions for constructing the State of Israel. She has taught at Brandeis, at Harvard University, UMass Amherst, and in important adult education programs such as Wexner, Zion, and Mea. In 2015, she held the Rohr Visiting Professorship at Harvard University, where she lectured on modern Israel and received the Derek Bach Certificate of Teaching Excellence. She is co-editor with Ilan Troen of the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century, which is a textbook for our summer course, actually. So, Dov, I often turn the floor to you.
Thank you, Lori. Let me begin, first of all, by thanking Professor Michael Zank for putting together this panel and for this entire event and for allowing us to have this conversation on this important subject, and also Peter for an excellent presentation, really compelling analysis of the current trends shaping the American-Jewish relationship with Israel and more broadly the political discussion around Israel today in American politics. I'm going to make some responses to Peter's remarks, but I think it might be useful at first to provide some historical perspective on this question, because I think all too often when we have conversations about the American-Jewish relationship with Israel, we tend to do so without enough historical perspective. We tend to kind of focus on the relationship today and not necessarily recognize that, in fact, this relationship has evolved considerably over the years and may continue to evolve in different directions in the future. So to very, very briefly, because I don't have much time to narrate this, the story of this relationship, I'll use the metaphor of this divorce, if you like, as to take this in. So if we begin, in a sense, before Israel's establishment in 1948, in the pre-state era, you might say that it was the courtship phase of this relationship. Specifically, the courtship was really a one-way courtship, whereby Zionists in Palestine, as well as Zionists in the United States, were trying to court American Jews whose support they needed in order to build up the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, and ultimately to convince the US government to support Jewish self-determination. During that early period of courtship, American Jews were, for the most part, hesitant about this potential courter, worried in particular as to whether, if they were to engage in a relationship with Zionism, they would somehow be accused of betraying their other relationship, namely with the United States. So there was a kind of concern over these dual loyalty allegations. After Israel's establishment, and I think until 1967, the next phase of this relationship I would describe as dating. Both sides were then kind of getting to know each other. They weren't really familiar with each other. There was an interest, American Jews had some interest in Israel, but were largely ignorant about what was going on there, and Israelis really were fairly disconnected from what was happening in the United States. So both sides were moving toward a closer relationship, but still somewhat different and largely preoccupied with other business. The consummation, if you like, of this relationship really occurred with the Six-Day War in 1967. And this really turned the relationship from this kind of dating into a passionate love affair, essentially an infatuation, if you like, particularly on the American Jewish side. As American Jews fell in love with Israel, this Israel, as Peter points out, the relationship with Israel becomes really central in to American Jewish identity, in American Jewish politics, and community life. But one thing, and I somewhat differ with Peter's analysis here, the secular tribalists, if you like, who fell in love with Israel during that period, I don't think it was so much that they were willing to set aside their liberalism in support of their Zionism, rather that they saw no tension between their liberalism and their Zionism. They looked at Israel in many ways through rose-tinted lenses. They weren't necessarily, people then weren't particularly aware of what was happening in Israel. They weren't nearly as familiar as we are today with developments in Israel, bearing in mind how difficult it was just to read an Israeli newspaper back then would have taken weeks, and you needed to speak Hebrew to do so. So in many ways, the love affair that American Jews had with Israel during this period of time was one based upon a kind of imaginary Israel, a fantasy. But in that imaginary Israel, in the Israel of the American Jewish imagination, it was an Israel that was seen as a liberal country, as a bastion of democracy in a region that was authoritarian. So it wasn't so much that they needed to code switch. They didn't experience the kind of dissonance maybe that their children might do. But that era of the infatuation of that intense love affair, that passionate love affair, that, like many infatuations, doesn't last very long. Eventually, passions cool, and eventually you get to know this person better, and you start to realize there are things maybe you don't like quite so much, and some distance starts to come into the relationship. And I would say the height of the passionate love affair was just about a decade, from 1967 to 1977, when Israelis voted in the Likud party and Menachem Begin in the massive electoral upheaval in 1977. Question marks began to arise for American Jews. Who are these people we've fallen in love with? Right? Do we know them quite as well as we felt we did? And really, from that point on, and particularly, I think, from the 1980s onwards, partly because of the war in Lebanon and the First Intifada, what we've seen over a long period of time is the kind of cooling of the love affair into a marriage, to be sure, a very close relationship, but one marked less by passion and infatuation, and a certain degree of disenchantment on both sides. And I think, in fact, the debate around Israel within the American Jewish community has actually been developing for a long time, I would say over decades, rather than just over the past few years. And in many ways, rather than heading to a divorce, rather than this couple who have become disenchanted and now are looking for a divorce, I think instead they're almost doomed to live together. Not in the same physical space, of course, but they're doomed to remain together because of, you might say, because of the children, because they find it difficult to completely separate. American Jews are still highly emotionally attached to Israel. They may be critical of Israeli government policies, but in terms of emotional attachment to Israel, there's really been very, very little change on the level of emotional attachment. So while American Jews may have become increasingly critical of Israeli government policies, I think Israel's role in American Jewish life and in American Jewish identity is still very strong. But the ways in which American Jews express their attachment or their love for Israel, if you like, is no longer through the kind of unconditional support for Israeli government policies. It's no longer expressed through the Israel right or wrong, or to use the analogy, my lover can do no wrong, they are perfect, but rather that love is now expressed through argument, through criticism. I wish you could just improve this. I wish you could change this. So in a sense, both sides in this relationship, I think, are stuck in something of a dysfunctional marriage, if you like. There is genuine affection and sympathy on both sides, but there are also significant areas of disagreement, and also, to some extent, a growing apart. Israel has changed in many significant ways over the last few decades, as has the American Jewish community, as Peter has mentioned. So I don't necessarily predict a divorce, but I do think the likelihood is rather a kind of loveless, dysfunctional relationship marked by constant bickering and an occasionally major crises. That's not necessarily a very happy prospect, but I think it does at least suggest that the relationship will continue. It will be a more challenging relationship, a more difficult, and certainly a more contentious relationship. But I think that relationship will remain, and is much more resilient than we sometimes give it credit for. Just as a final point in terms of the characterization of the debate and the conflict within the American Jewish community over Israel, certainly I agree with Peter's analysis that in some ways we can see this as a debate between kind of ethnic particularism or tribalism and secular universalism. But I also think it's not just a debate over American identity. It's not just a stand-in. It's also very much a debate over Jewish identity. It's a debate not just over what America is and how Americans see Israel, but how Jews see themselves and how Jews understand Jewish identity, Jewish history, and collective memory. So in that sense, the ethnic particularists, if you like, or tribalists are themselves divided. People who are deeply committed to Israel, deeply particularistic, if you like, may also be critical of Israeli government policies precisely because they see it as endangering the Israel that they love and the Israel that they care about, particularly in Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So I think we have to recognize that there's a quote that comes to mind in this context by the writer and theorist George Steiner, who wrote, "Universalism is the particularism of the Jews." And the idea is that in invoking universalism or in this debate, it's not just a debate between American ideals and Jewish ones. It's actually a struggle over the very meaning of what is Jewish identity and what is Judaism. In that respect, your call for if we could discuss Torah or Jewish texts, and we might find a consensus that we don't share over Israel, I would suggest actually, no, we would find the same areas of disagreement and debate. The fact of the matter is, the history of the Jews, and certainly over the last 2 centuries, is one marked by constant disagreement over the very meaning of Jewishness, Jewish history, Jewish identity, and Israel. So in that respect, what we share is that we agree to argue. I mean, the argument is the thing that we share. It is the willingness to engage in argument. Beyond that, I don't actually think, nor do I believe it's necessary to search for a lost consensus, whether that be a consensus around Israel or a consensus in Jewish texts or Jewish tradition, which also never existed. So I think in some ways we are destined to live with this argument. And I think that the challenge is, given, as Peter, in my mind, correctly describes, that we are facing this intracommunal civil war, we just have to ensure that rather than a war, at least, rather than the war metaphor, we can conduct this debate and this argument in a civil manner which doesn't end up creating so many victims.
Thank you, Dov. Another word about format. After each speaker speaks, we will give Peter a chance to respond, and then I'll open it up to the room. I just want to underscore the one point of difference that I heard for you to note, and that is that Professor Waxman indicates that the relationship is an ongoing love relationship, though increasingly complicated over time, because that's what happens over time, and that conversation is sometimes what long married people do very loudly. And the other point that I would want to maybe put off for later is that this is the English professor in me. There are limits to all metaphors and analogies, and I worry a little bit over this metaphor of love, marriage, and divorce, because love, marriage, and divorce happens between individuals, and both Israel and American Jewry are such complicated landscapes that some of us in America, some American Jews, may feel married to some constituencies in Israel and less so to others. So just to, be aware of models and metaphors and their limits. Eve.
Okay, well, I start by feeling so many people to thank, so little time. So of course, Michael Zank and Teresa, and my fellow panelists, to Peter for his bravery and Lori for all of her wonderful wisdom, which we explored over dinner. And I was going to say, and to Dov Waxman for the best metaphor I ever heard. So you see there are debates within the community. And I'm sure to Rachel as well. I have not met her yet, but I'm sure I will be falling in love with her wisdom as well. So I really have two different sets of comments that I wanted to share. One is that, and speaks more directly to the conversation as it has been established, and particularly in Peter's very brave work over a period of time. And, even though I greatly respect and admire his writings, I think there are some things with the conversation on his terms that need to be tweaked a bit. And so, for example, we're talking a lot about Israel and the American Jewish community, nuancing it with generations and with cultural styles. But we're talking really about two sets of people, and Palestinians come up and are mentioned, on one side as terrorists and on the other side as victims, but not with much agency in their own right, not with much reality in their own right. And I think this is not just, political correctness and look how woke I am. This is really about the elephant in the phone booth. If we're not going to talk about the elephant in the phone booth, then, we need to do so. And so I think that Palestinian agency needs to play a larger role in this conversation than it presently does. And I think that if you go in that direction, it leads you onto a path in which human rights, the assumption of the inherent dignity and equal worth of every person, should really ground that conversation. It helps you to move beyond the terrorist or the victim to a conversation about human rights. That might also include Palestinian Americans. And that, in turn, I think leads you to a place where, and so these remarks are going to be brief, this first set of remarks, but it leads you pretty directly to a place that I think Peter does know that the conversation is going, that I think will be a big challenge to us to meet with civility and interest. And that is that the conversation is going to move from being about the occupation to being about Zionism. It is going to move from 67 to 48 and indeed maybe 1878. And, I think we need, if we wish to have a second honeymoon in this troubled and difficult marriage, we need to be prepared for that conversation with some maturity, civility, and forbearance. So that's my most direct response to Peter's work. Now, when I teach on this subject, one of the things that I try to do very much is, beyond also creating, recognizing Palestinian voice and agency, is to what I call deboutique the issue. That is to think about Israel and Palestine as itself and America as themselves, but also as case studies in larger conversations, contributing to many larger conversations. And I think that is also a possible future in which there is some common ground to work. And so the position I would take with regard to that is that I think all of us are faced with two great problems coming at us, for which we have neither a substantively adequate nor a politically viable solutions yet. And those are globalization. This is not original with me, of course, globalization in all of its many dimensions, and climate change. So I want to talk just a little bit about how those concerns, which I think are deeply engaging, especially for the younger generation and for our students, might be linked to this conversation. So if you think about the many dimensions of globalization, there's the movement of capital around the world, producing deindustrialization in some places, and a shift of manufacturing to places where neither labor nor the environment has any protections. In an earlier incarnation, I worked for about 15 years on issues of worker health and safety. So research, for example, by the ILO, looking into the conduct of business in the free trade zones between the West Bank and Israel, is a case in point. This is research conducted by lawyers, and they find a lot to be desired there in labor relations and environmental protections. Globalization includes the movement of peoples, including, of course, refugee flows, and refugee flows including climate refugees. And so if you think of the work of Elie Wiesel and Ahmed Sheikh in a book called The Conflict Shoreline, they argue that almost all of the most lethal disagreements in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Bahrain, Yemen, Libya, all occur on the aridity line, the line between land where there is enough water to grow food and land where that is not the case. That leads to climate refugees, inadequate food, and so forth. And so we have contributions and thoughts in that area. Globalization includes the movement of culture and ideas, changing consumer standards at the same time that we're dealing with the environmental limits, dueling commitments to individual and group rights. And this is one of the places where I think the left critique of human rights doctrine, that it enshrines a ferocious version of individualism, as written about by, among others, Professor Mahmoud Mamdani at Columbia, is a useful body of literature to consider. There's a movement of technology that spreads environmental hazards and joblessness well in advance of any political institutions for universal benefits or guaranteed social wage. There are emerging new forms of governmental authority, supra-national, WTO, IMF, World Bank, that challenge local sovereignties and which recast, I think, for example, the one-state, two-state conversation, because Israel and Palestine are a small place. They're slightly larger than New Jersey. And so if we look at that as against the background of the WTO subverting national sovereignty, you begin to see that we're talking about the state of East New Jersey and the state of West New Jersey. It just creates a different set of conversations that you can have. I'm not advocating here for one or another position. I'm advocating for the conversation and the debate. We also see the emergence of new organizational forms, NGOs taking the place that was once served by labor, community, and government obligations. And so we see a very lively conversation in Israel-Palestine about what's called the NGOization of this and that, promoted, for example, by scholars like Rima Hamami and Islah Jad. And then, of course, climate change. That's the one on which we're on a very tight timeline. And it's clearly not just about rising sea levels and the changing value of your holiday home on the Cape. It is about changing how and where and how much food can be produced, how and where people can live. And it's also, of course, about changing military strategies. I just had a PhD student who's a colonel in the US Army and who completed a dissertation on the greening of the Army. And she was not thinking about, getting cadets at West Point to turn out the lights and recycle their Coke cans. She was talking about all the strategic planning that's going on, considering new routes for moving military personnel and materiel as ice breaks up, new vulnerabilities as enemies can approach us by different approaches, and so on and so forth. So there are so many conversations that I think are engaging to, particularly to students, but hopefully to all of us. a room full of people who braved the Red Sox traffic coming, and I fear are going to have to brave it again going home. And so I'm suggesting that another way to go is to face much more into the future and much less into the past, and to bring Israel and Palestine questions into larger conversations. And so that would be my suggestion.
So thank you, Eve, for really widening the lens here, offering a very broad perspective. It reminds me, Peter, that one of my reactions to a small moment in your remarks is that our students and rising generations are so much more concerned with climate change and globalization than they are with that. Increasingly that's preoccupying, but it feels to me that people can carry multiple sets of concerns at the same time, be concerned about, what we're having for dinner as well as climate change. So I wonder what we do with scale and perspective when you give us these such big concerns. Yep. Rachel, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zank. Thank you, Teresa and Elie Wiesel Center, and thank you, Peter, for your comments, and Dov and Eva and Lori for moderating. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to pick up a little bit where Dov left off, which is, I would argue the relationship isn't just about how it has changed over time with the American Jewish community, but also in terms of how it's been expressed. So after the 1982 Lebanon War, what you begin to see is American Jews are still deeply engaged, but they come from a position of protest. And as Michael Walzer talked about, it was beginning a phase of being a connected critic. In that respect, as a political philosopher, he's referring to the prophets. But many American Jews also saw themselves as being connected critics. And so you begin this philanthropy of protest, which goes into the NGOs that you're referring to. But it wasn't a discussion about dissolving any kind of meaningful relationship. In addition to that, and I'll pick up on a piece that Eva mentioned, which I thought of immediately, is that this debate is not about 1967. It actually has nothing to do with 1967, right? Because if we really zoom out and look at these issues, first of all, we have to understand, when we saw this in Gershom Gorenberg's work with the Accidental Empire, that it's the Labor Party who's helping sanction and give the hechsher for the settlement projects that are taking place throughout the West Bank. I guarantee you the majority of our students, well, our students know this, but the majority of most students don't know this, right? They think it's only the right-wing Israeli government and it happened under, Likud. And they don't understand what happened under Labor and why it happened. And that these were people who were pragmatic about there should be a Palestinian state. It wasn't on idealistic terms that they said it shouldn't, but they said because of security, we can't have it at this point in time, and we can't have it in this particular way, and we need to have some distance here, and so on and so forth. Gantz, for example, absolutely was a pragmatist. He said, yes, there should be a Palestinian state, but not today. It's not going to happen. Netanyahu, we know where he stands on this. And at the same time, what I would say is that for all of those issues, that's a very lively debate that happens within Israeli society across the political spectrum and across the demographic frameworks. From the younger are engaged in that to the older. There are, of course, the right-wing trends that are happening globally. There are the right-wing trends that you are right to point out, Peter, specifically about sectors within Israeli society. You have sectors of the Israeli population, Jewish population, who do not have a practice with democracy, right? Whether it's the ultra-Orthodox, whether it's the Mizrahi who come from places in the Arab world, or whether it's the Russian population who is not voting based upon religion, but rather on security issues, particularism issues, and very much see themselves more comfortable in an authoritarian type government rather than a democracy, because they don't have practice with democracy yet. Remember, Israel is still an immigrant society. So all of that also compounds this situation. Now, the American Jews that you referred to as the secular tribalists, and then they're the secular universalists who are their children. Those secular tribalists did not impose the lens of America on Israel. They understood that Israel was a very different nation state that had a different history, that did not come from the origins and from the inception or the birth of liberal Western values in the way that America did. So the prism, for example, that my students read the New York Times about religion and state, their parents didn't read the same prism necessarily onto Israel. It's similar to what you're saying, Dov, right? They understood that there was universalism and particularism, that they ought to be in a healthy tension, which actually makes it quite harder to function, as we all know. And their children have forgotten what particularism is. And maybe that's because of religion, to a certain extent. But as the American Jewish community has become more accepted within the American larger landscape, Jews are seen as part of the white majority. They're not seen as part of a vulnerable minority. And that plays out all the more so in challenging ways on campus. Because particularism is acceptable and it's healthy for people of color, for women, for gender issues, but not for Jews. Jews are not allowed to have a particularism. And if they do, it's at the expense of the other. And so they look at this discussion that's happening, like Jonathan Haidt mentions when he talks about the telos of the university, the purpose of the university. And he says, is the purpose of the university to pursue emet, veritas, truth, or is it to pursue social justice? Because they're actually at odds with one another. And our students and younger generations think that they have to sublimate their particularism because particularism in the Jewish context is seen as being narrow and tribal in a negative way. And I would argue that we actually have an incredible opportunity to reclaim tribalism, that there's an opportunity here in which it doesn't have to be parochial. And part of this is because many young people don't have what you were calling Torah, I would call largely Jewish education. Right? Yep. And what do I mean by that? They don't know the debates of Achad Ha'am and Berdichevsky. They don't know the debates of Zev Jabotinsky. They don't know about Ben Gurion and all his multiple colors, or Begin for that matter. They have no idea who Martin Buber was when it comes to the discussion of Zionism and why he believed in binationalism, but at the same time did not always agree with Judah Magnus, who also was a binationalist. They are not steeped in this. We are. We're obsessed with it, partly because we're nerds, right? Yes. Partly because we have made this our academic profession. But we've decided in Jewish education, you know what, we're going to simplify. We like falafel and hummus and Yom HaAtzmaut. And we don't want to make you have to actually think about the complexity. But guess what? They can. They want to. But they've never been exposed to it. Now, the students who are involved, the younger people with If Not Now, 100% they're much more deeply invested in that conversation. They understand that Zionism is not just a refuge, but it has the potential to be a laboratory for the Jewish people. And that to them is very exciting. It's very exciting if that particularism can look more like universalism and if it can have an American liberal values tilt. And part of it is helping them understand that Israel was conceived from a place in the region of the Middle East in which it's the Ottoman Empire, in which you don't have separation of church and state. It's not part of Israel's DNA. It wasn't in the Ottoman Empire, and the Millet system is a carry through to that today. But they don't know what that is. They don't understand that. They need to understand it. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to, if you're a citizen of the state of Israel, engage in thinking about what does it mean to have civil marriage and civil divorce. I'm not suggesting that should be pushed aside. But Israelis are doing that. Right. That's a vibrant conversation that's taking place that most of our younger people don't know. Meaning the American Jewish community who's in this younger component, this younger sector, who says, why is it that there's no debate about Israel? It's just historically inaccurate. Right. As Dov is suggesting, there was always debate. In the 1950s, when Hans Kohn immigrates to this country, Hans Kohn says, I don't really like what Israel is becoming as a Zionist entity. It's too narrow, it's too chauvinistic, but I think that the American Jewish Committee should create scholarships for Hebrew University students who are Arabs. That was a manifestation of his ideas of binationalism. Tell me how many students know that? Very, very few. They don't know about Brei Ra. They don't know about the decisions that were made by AIPAC and the history of AIPAC and the challenges that you referenced a little bit. They just don't know it, but that's because they don't want to know it. I have to tell you, I think there's an ulterior motive. I think the ulterior motive of some of these students, not all, but some of them, is to begin with the starting point of, does Israel have a right to exist? And according to them, they actually don't think so because it's not in accordance with Western liberal values as they understand it through their American experience. And so then it's not about 1967, it's about 1948, which was the original sin. Because what Israel created was a nation state that tried, not always successfully, to balance universalism and particularism. And that balance has shifted over time. And it depends who's in power, it depends on regional circumstances. And we, as American Jews, may not always like what we see. We have the choice to move there. Most of us are choosing not to, for a variety of reasons. But we choose to vote here. But the debates are very much alive, and I would argue, in terms of that conversation being alive, is that it's our responsibility to give them that deeper education and to help them understand that Zionism is the refuge. It has to be. American Jews may not feel it, but Jews in France sure do. Yep. Jews in other parts of Europe sure do. But if they understood the possibility for it to be a laboratory where they could actually really engage in thinking through the complexity of what it means to be a majority, what does it mean to actually hold power and have to make very difficult decisions? What does it mean when you're the mother of an 18-year-old and they have to decide between the time I would walk from here to there whether or not I would shoot someone based upon the way they look? It's impossible decisions that my children will never have to make unless they choose to make Aliyah. It's just a different world for our American Jewish community, which we want to impose on the Israeli Jewish community. Now, are there serious changes that are happening? 100%. Because as the American Jewish community shifts leftward, not just only in terms of where we are today, but where we are going, and the Israeli Jewish community continues to shift rightward, the discussions are much more difficult to have. The things that we hold so dear, religious pluralism, are anathema, right? It's either chiloni, secular, or lo dati, not religious. They don't understand all the comparisons and shades in between. And it's changing a little bit, but very little. And there are important organizations that are trying to do that work. But the majority don't actually understand the way we practice, how we relate to this place, how we think about this place. And there have to be opportunities for greater interaction, for meaningful engagement between Israeli Jews, between American Jews. And look, our young community isn't interested in learning to speak Hebrew. It's another major difference that we didn't talk about. And yes, much of the other world Jewry does speak Hebrew, and they're invested in this. So what's our common language? What's our historical memory? And can we come to a shared understanding of the values of Medinat Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, and Am Yisrael?
Thank you, Rachel, for a very forceful response, very careful, very nuanced. I am mindful of the clock, and I'm going to make an adjustment. Do we have 10 minutes, Michael, do you think? Okay, because we had said till 9, or let's say we'll go till 9:15. I do want, Peter, for you to have the last word and to respond, but I think it would be useful to take a few responses and questions from the room first, and then we'll allow Peter to respond, and if there's still time, we can take some, yes, I'll take a few at once. Hang on, a couple things I want to say. The first is, many of us here are educators, and I just want to suggest that there is a generation out there that goes on Birthright, that visits Israel, that takes our classes. Dov's classes are packed. So I am just, I want to qualify the suggestion that there is a generation out there that is ignorant and ill-informed about Jewish life. And also, there is a tremendous liberal Jewish educational system, a day school system, whether it's Schechter or all the systems through or what exactly that. So that's another piece to just challenge here. That are there multiple liberal Zionisms and not just refuge Zionism for this rising generation? And I want to say I will take a few comments and questions now, but I will privilege students, and I would ask students who are in the room, there are many of you, to please brave this moment and raise your hands. There you are. They're over there. Michael, to our right. Michael, this way. Oh, you got someone. Great. Okay. And I'll take 3 right now, and then we'll...
Hello? Is this on? All right. Hey. So thank you, Peter, for an amazing speech. One thing I was thinking about in terms of this tension between internationalism and universalism and particularism is that there is kind of an American tradition of resolving the two, which is kind of like Wilsonian universalism, which is national self-determination, right? And so why has that been discredited? Why isn't that on the table? And related to that, it's kind of a countervailing trend. Could some of the leftish kind of communitarianism be a force that goes towards a Wilsonian vision rather than an individualistic vision?
Yeah, that's fine.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been a great event. I have a question for you. I'm from the Boston suburban Jewish community, and I grew up with Zionist parents and, went to religious school after going to public school during the day. I went to Jewish day camp. I was a counselor there, went on Birthright, did Hillel. And one thing that I think was so disappointing for me as a college student at the beginning was I found that I didn't have the proper tools in my toolbox to discuss Israel. And I'm wondering, not everyone goes to Jewish day school, right? And I want to know whose responsibility it is to give us those tools, because as Rachel pointed out, often there's sort of this reductive essence to what we do know about Israel, and throwing, an Israeli teen at a Jewish overnight camp and saying, oh, here, she can teach you about Israel. She's 16. That's not her responsibility, right? So whose job do you think that is?
That's great. We'll take one more.
Hi, thank you for a phenomenal panel. So I wanted to ask a question to Rachel. You talked about, so I'm a Jew from Istanbul. I was born and raised there, and I was kind of taken aback by your characterization of Mizrahi Jews as unexperienced with democracy and making a culturalist argument that they will not mesh with a democratic system. And with your general comment, I think sounds to me like you're using cultural relativism to excuse Israel's actions, and also to kind of dismiss the importance of Mizrahi communities in Israel as agents of change. So I would like to hear more about that from you.
Great. We'll start with Peter, and then Rachel, panelists will have an opportunity.
There's so much to respond to. I guess I would say, I think for me the critical kind of descriptive analytical question is, if one takes Dov's metaphor of the marriage or Rachel's point about the connected critic, what does that look like when we add in Eve's point, right? Which is that we have a fundamental questioning of Zionism itself. Can you be in a marriage if you're not a Zionist? And can you be a connected critic if you're not a Zionist, right? What does that look like? And I think that the problem I had with Rachel's passionate talk was that I don't buy the idea that younger Jews in general are more ignorant than their parents. And the reason I think it's easy when you take Palestinians out of the equation, that becomes easier, right? Their parents probably didn't know who Berdichevsky was either. The fundamental difference, I think, especially among the activist kids, the kids in If Not Now and J Street U, the fundamental difference of their parents is, to go to Eve's point, is that for them, Palestinians are much more visible. They are actually much more familiar with the experience of Palestinians. And we have an American Jewish establishment that is generally ignorant of that. The reason it's ignorant is because it systematically avoids bringing in Palestinians to its institutions. Palestinians rarely go to speak at synagogues. They rarely speak at Jewish community centers. The trips, most famously Birthright, but all the other little trips that synagogues take basically largely avoid contact with Palestinians. And to go to your question, I think the reason that so many American Jewish kids feel so betrayed when they go to university is, yes, and this includes the kids at Jewish day school, like your kids and mine, is not just because they haven't been taught the history of Zionism, but even more profoundly because they've never read a book by a Palestinian. They've never heard a Palestinian speaker. They've never seen a movie created by a Palestinian. So they're utterly unprepared for the experience that Palestinians will present to them when they meet them. We have failed them in that regard. I think we failed to humanize Palestinians, and we've also failed them to actually equip them to actually debate with Palestinians, because the Palestinian kids are much more familiar with the Zionist narrative than the Jewish kids are with the Palestinian experience. So I think that fundamentally what I think we need to do, what I would hope the American Jewish community would do would be invite in a conversation about Zionism and say we should have a conversation about Zionism and accept that, as they say, every generation, hears the voice of Sinai anew, that we will have in that a younger generation that asks very hard, tough questions about Zionism, and we should have if the American Jewish community is a Zionistic community, which it is, it should have the self-confidence to be involved in those conversations, those arguments, and because I fear the consequences of not doing it are twofold. First of all, you push a lot of young Jewish kids away because they feel like they can't ask those questions, which for them is a betrayal of what they feel like are Jewish values of questioning. Secondly, that the American Jewish community, the organized American Jewish community, is becoming one of the greatest threats to free speech in the United States, because the effort to criminalize boycott, divestment, sanction, and to define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and therefore suggest that constitutes bigotry is, you don't take my word for it. Ask the ACLU. Right? We have more and more legislation, which is essentially which is designed to prevent a conversation about Zionism, right? Rather than have the argument about Zionism, which ends up actually repressing people's free speech rights when they want to question Zionism. And I think we should have the self-confidence, the intellectual and moral self-confidence of the community to actually have that argument rather than trying to repress the argument.
Since one of the questions was directed at Rachel, I'm going to go to Rachel and then invite the rest of the panelists to respond.
Sure. So it was a generalization. Listen, the Mizrahi community is 50% of the Israeli population, which also goes to my point that this is not a Western country in the way that we understand it. This is a country that has very important Eastern components to it, and Eastern components that are cultural, that are political, and that influence the landscape. The Mizrahi is a more traditional component of society, right? Meaning the Masorti movement, not in a conservative way, right? But in terms of just engaged in religion and practice. So my point being is that whether it's Russians, which is different also, because we're not talking about religion, whether it's the Mizrahi or the ultra-Orthodox, they have a different political experience that does not always resonate with democracy. And they have to learn democratic practices, which are possible, but don't always come naturally. And that's a process that happens over time, just as any immigrant society. And I think the Mizrahi have had, in terms of a large sector of society, a huge influence over Israeli culture and Israeli life, and will continue to do so. There's no cultural relativism that I'm suggesting, and I think they're an important component within Israeli society, but Israel is not a white Ashkenazi secular society anymore, which is how it was understood when it was created. This is a society that has very much changed over time, and the Mizrahi is a part of that change. In terms of the whose job is it, and I think it's a really important question, I think that American education about US foreign policy, education about world events, and education about current events in a Jewish setting or in a public school setting have failed on this topic, writ large, right? It's just failed. Now, I don't blame high school educators who are tasked with the impossible of teaching world history in 10th grade. None of us have to do that, right? In 13 weeks, we get to talk about Zionism, right? It's very different, and they have this impossible task. However, let's be very clear. These educators who are trying their best take curriculum from universities like Georgetown, like Columbia, and other places that have highly polemical and political agendas that are funded by Saudi Arabia and Aramco. That happens on a regular basis, and it's turnkey, and so teachers use it because why not when it has the hechsher of Georgetown? So this is a big problem, and in terms of the Jewish educational system, we can't shy away as Jews who deeply care about education from complexity, right? My conversations with my students and my young children is when you leave the classroom, your sentences should be ending with question marks rather than exclamation points. Because I didn't do my job if you walk out of here with a black and white position. I actually want you to struggle in the gray mud, which is much more difficult and grapples with all of these issues. So that's on us. That's on us in terms of our institutions. That's about bringing in Palestinian voices, which we did at Brandeis every single moment we could, because we understood that Palestinians and Israelis are interconnected deeply, and you have to understand that there's no homogeneous Palestinian identity. There's a multiplicity of perspectives. Now here's where you lost me, Peter, and I have to say it. This issue of free speech, if I'm a student at Emory University and I live off campus, and last Thursday I get an eviction notice that tells me, as a fake notice, how I have no right to exist and I'm engaged in colonialism, and the only reason it happens is because there's a mezuzah on my door which marks me as a Jew, I think it's anti-Semitism. I actually have no problem. I have zero problem labeling it, and if that's what BDS is, I have a problem because you're not pro-Palestinian, you are anti-Israel. You are anti-Jew. Because what you are trying to do is to intimidate Jews who desire national self-determination. And I want Palestinians to have agency. I think they deserve a state. I think that there are opportunities in which there have not been able to be created, and there need to be opportunities to figure out how to do it, but not at the expense of the Jewish sovereignty. I refuse to allow that to happen on my watch, and I think it's imperative that university administrators understand that they cannot hide behind the guise of academic freedom and freedom of speech when it's hate speech, because if it was about a noose on a black student's door, or if it was about an anti-gay position towards any other group, guarantee there would be a statement very strong immediately, within 24 hours. But because Jews are not seen as a vulnerable minority, but as a large majority, we are not given the same understanding in any shape or form.
Can I respond to that? An eviction notice on a Jewish student's door is horrific, obviously. But to equate that, right, to equate that with the BDS movement, right, I think is wrong. The BDS movement, which I disagree with, I do not support the BDS, I do not support boycotting Israel inside the Green Line, is a nonviolent protest movement aimed at trying to secure Palestinian rights. Does it have the same vision as me? No, but to say that Palestinians, who we rightly say should not commit acts of terrorism, are also not allowed to protest nonviolently, or that Palestinians have to be Zionists, right? Newsflash. Most Palestinians are not Zionists, don't support the idea of Jewish statehood, because although Jewish statehood has been a tremendous blessing for the Jewish people, Jewish statehood privileges Jews over Palestinians. And I think the vast majority of us, were we Palestinians, would also not want a state that privileges Jews over us. And so when you can, the eviction notices are horrible, but I'm talking about state-sponsored laws. I'm talking about things like the University of California system getting this close to saying that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, so therefore Palestinian politics, period, because Palestinians are anti-Zionist, is bigotry and criminalized. That seems to me something that we American Jews should fight against just as much as we fight against the anti-Semitism that we see at Emory.
So thank you very much.